Welcome again. Tonight's reading is Satan's Trilogy, reading number 6. Esther seldom boasted, but cooking was a passion for her. She had hopes of practicing it more someday. Standing outside of the car, Esther gazed at the neon sign. Memories of her childhood village rushed through her mind. Esther chose not to mention her dad had left her at a monastery in the mountains, where she learned martial arts from the monks. There she learned to draw from within an inner strength referred to as ki. Walking towards the restaurant, Esther couldn't contain herself. Now I am very excited to enjoy this meal. Having said that, Esther's pace picked up just a bit. The restaurant's aromas filled the outside air. Esther and Brandy both started to anticipate the meal. Walking up to the front door, each had one arm around the other. Brandy was several inches shorter than Esther, and so her arm was below Esther's arm. The front door was varnished mahogany with a large ornate brass handle. The glass in the door was tinted green and had a beautiful etched landscape of the mountain of Sha Tin. After opening the door, they stood in a foyer filled with framed photos of old Hong Kong. Esther stopped to look at the photos hanging on the walls. Many of the landscapes were familiar to her, and others had changed dramatically with China's industrialization. There was even a photo of the monastery she had called home. Finally, the smell of the food enticed her and Brandy to abandon the photos for a meal. The second door was the same as the first, but with clear glass. Entering the restaurant, they were met by a short and old Chinese man wearing a dark blue silk suit. He wore a matching blue shirt made from silk, and he did not have a tie. "Welcome to my restaurant. I am Mr. Hung. Do you have reservations?" he asked. "No, we don't. My niece just arrived from out of town, and she wanted to enjoy some wonderful Chinese food," Brandy told him. Proudly, the old man boasted, "You have come to the right place. It's early, so you don't need reservations at this hour. Would you like a booth or table?" Esther quickly spoke up. "A table against the wall would be nice." Mr. Hung smiled at Esther. Please follow me." The restaurant was long and narrow, sandwiched between two other businesses that had gone under. Yet it was a lot larger than one might assume from outward appearances. The tables were staggered, and only 3 tables were allowed between the widths of the walls. The booths were placed in the far end of the room. The tables were covered with yellow silk tablecloths, neatly centered and nicely hemmed. Each table had a lit candle in a clear glass bowl. Mr. Hung took them to a table against the left side of the restaurant and asked if the table would do. "Yes, this is an excellent table for us," responded Esther. Mr. Hung seemed very pleased. Esther, having taken a chair against the wall, sat down and unfolded the napkin. Mr. Hung handed each a menu and said their waiter would be with them immediately. As he stepped away, a young Chinese man approached the table. "Welcome to Sha Tin Restaurant. My name is Quion. May I have your orders for something to drink, and while you look at our menu?" the young man said. Brandy asked for water and coffee. Esther ordered iced water and hot black tea. "If you don't mind, I'd like to order our appetizer, a large order of fried wontons with hot sesame sauce," said Esther. "Of course, I'll bring them right away," the waiter replied. He immediately returned with some iced water, filling both glasses on the table. Another young Chinese waiter brought Esther her black tea, then poured it carefully into her cup. After sipping some of her tea, Esther placed the cup down and seemed a bit more relaxed. The waiter soon returned with the fried wontons, placing a healthy portion in front of Brandy and Esther. Taking a step back, the waiter waited to hear approval of the food. Using her chopsticks, Esther lifted a wonton and took the first bite. Her face lit up, and anyone could tell she was delighted with the dish. "These are wonderful. I have never enjoyed this dish so much," said Esther. By now, Brandy had taken a bite using her fork, and she agreed. "Yes, these are wonderful wontons." The waiter left with a smile on his face, thanking the ladies for their approval. Esther had already decided what she would have for a meal. Brandy continued looking at the menu for another minute or two, then set the menu down on the corner of the table. Once Brandy put the menu down, their waiter returned to the table. Brandy asked Esther to go ahead and give her order. "I'll have the Cantonese-style honey-glazed roast pork, some chow fun noodle soup, and your noodles with spicy brown meat sauce." Esther looked at Brandy to signal she had completed her order. Brandy thought for a minute and said, "I couldn't possibly have said that better, and I'll have the same. Please take my coffee and bring some black tea for me." The waiter voiced the opinion that Esther had made excellent choices and that dishes will be immediately prepared. Esther was a little surprised at her aunt's appetite and so said, "And Brandy, I appreciate your bringing me here, but I understand that you had lunch just a short time ago. Are you certain that you want to order so much food?" Brandy hesitated for a bit and then confessed, "Well, Esther, I went out during my lunch break, but it wasn't for lunch. I've been dating a doctor and we spent some time together during my lunch hour." Looking slightly embarrassed, Brandy knew Esther was old enough to understand the truth and certainly wise enough not to pass judgment. "Oh, well, I am glad that we can both enjoy this meal together then. Good food should be enjoyed with friends and family." Esther picked up her chopsticks again and continued enjoying the wontons. "And Brandy," said Esther, "these wontons are either better than back home or my appetite is playing tricks on me. Either way, I am loving this dish." Having said that, Esther placed another wonton into her mouth. The remaining dishes were brought to the table in a very short time, and the waiter again waited to hear if they met with approval. Esther was very pleased and thanked the waiter for such an excellent meal, as did Brandy. A third young man brought ice water and filled their glasses. As he moved around the table behind Esther, he caught a glimpse of some ink work on Esther's back. The top of her collar was positioned just low enough to show a small part of Esther's back and a partial glimpse of a tattoo. Asking if there was anything that he could do for them, he stood back a moment for the reply. Esther thanked him and said, "No, we have everything we need." Taking a half step back, the young man turned to Esther and spoke in Chinese. "Are you called Shanzidu?" Esther was shocked. How did this young man know this name? Many years ago, her teacher gave her the name Shanzidu. Was there risk here? Esther didn't think so and decided to reply, speaking in Chinese. "Shanzidu? Yes, I am called Shanzidu by my teacher." Brandy looked at the young man, then looked at Esther. She was puzzled by the conversation in Chinese. The young man bowed to Esther and excused himself. Brandy hurriedly asked Esther, "What was that all about?" "I'm really not certain. Somehow he knew my Chinese name, given to me many years ago by my teacher. He asked if I was called Shanzidu. I've had that name nearly my entire life," Esther explained. Brandy started to ask another question but paused when she saw the entire kitchen staff come out and to the dining room led by the owner, Mr. Hung. Approaching their table and stopping a respectable distance away, perhaps 6 feet, Mr. Hung spoke in Chinese. Please forgive the interruption. Again in Chinese. Are you a student of Master Zhao, called Shanzidu? Esther realized that it was time to follow Chinese etiquette and to stand before the people addressing her. Leaving her chair and facing everyone in front of her, Esther replied to Mr. Hung's question, speaking in Chinese. Shanzidu, many years ago my teacher named me Shanzidu. He is like a father to me. Immediately, Mr. Hung and all the workers bowed to Esther. Esther understood the appropriate response was to bow back to them, which she did. They had all just greeted her with open respect. Mr. Hung went on to explain in his native Chinese that Master Zhao had written him many letters about his best student and adopted daughter, Shanzidu. For over 20 years, Mr. Hung had cooked for Master Zhao, and they had developed a strong bond. Mr. Hung left for this country to be close to his children, but he and Mr. Zhao had remained friends and communicated by letters. Because of this, Mr. Hung explained, the daughter of my most honorable friend honors me by eating at my table. Mr. Hung couldn't say enough about how his friendship with Mr. Zhao led them to be as brothers. Because of this friendship, he asked Esther to accept him as her uncle. Esther replied in Chinese, I would be honored to call you uncle. Mr. Hung was very pleased, and after each of the workers shook Esther's hand, expressing how honored they were to meet her, they returned to work. Esther sat down to enjoy her meal, and Brandy couldn't wait to ask, what the heck just happened? So Esther explained, when I was living in Hong Kong, my father left me with a very wise man. He was a friend to my dad, and he became my teacher. His name, Master Zhao. It seems that Mr. Hung was the cook for Master Zhao for many years, and they became very close, much as brothers. They have communicated with each other by letters since Mr. Hung came to this country. Master Zhao had mentioned me several times in his letters to Mr. Hung. Esther paused and went on. Master Zhao and I became very close, and he accepted me as his daughter. Mr. Hung asked me to accept him as his uncle. It is a great honor, and of course I said yes. Brandy sat with her mouth slightly open for a few seconds. Wow, you've flown halfway around the world, and you made a good friend of someone you know in Hong Kong. Wow, it really is a small world. Esther continued to explain, my dad trusted Mr. Zhao to help raise me. The day I left his school, Mr. Zhao told me that the world offers as many opportunities as it does obstacles. He asked me to remember that everything in life happens for a reason. My dad and Mr. Zhao are two of the wisest people I have ever known. Esther looked at her aunt and smiled. Today I was twice blessed. Having said this, Esther continued eating. Looking at Esther, Brandy sat in amazement. She was wise beyond her years. Everything her brother had said about his daughter was true. Brandy thought to herself, my niece is going to amaze me every day for a long time. Brandy went back to eating. The food was absolutely wonderful. In a matter of minutes, Esther had managed to empty her dishes. Brandy was beginning to feel very full as she took her last bite. Kion removed the dishes from the table. Having completed their meal, Mr. Hung approached and said, Shanzidu, I know that you have many things on your mind. Your family, should you need anything, please come and see me. I am very pleased to have another niece. Visit me sometime during the daytime. We will have a nice visit," Mr. Hung said with a loving smile. "Welcome home." Mr. Hung turned to Brandy and thanked her for coming to his restaurant. "It was an honor to serve you both." And that's the end of reading 6.